The last couple of lessons we've been talking about the supply and demand model. In this lesson we're going to be talking about the role of prices in that model, and in particular looking at the concept of elasticity, which is a way that economists describe the supply and demand curves in the supply and demand model. Recall the supply and demand model can be represented graphically, where you put the price on the vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal axis. And then you can consider the demand curve, which is this downward sloping line reflecting the fact that when prices are lower, the quantity demanded of the product, whatever it happens to be, goes up. And then there's the supply curve, which represents the behavior of firms, and when their price goes up, they want to supply a quantity larger, so the quantity supplied goes up. And then we have the equilibrium, where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and that determines the price in the market as well as the total quantity transacted. Now, when you think about this model, the role of the price is very, very important. When a curve shifts, prices will move to affect behavior. Prices will signal what should happen in the market when there's a change in demand. Perhaps people want to buy more of the product, more bicycles or more ice cream. Prices will signal something, and then there'll be in addition incentive both to the firms to produce more if the price goes up, or consumers to consume less if the price goes up. And it also affects the income distribution. You can illustrate this with the supply and demand diagram. So let me do this right on the screen here. So let's just draw the picture with the price on the vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal axis as usual. And we can have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. And let's suppose there's a shift in the demand curve, as we've talked about before, and suppose the demand curve shifts out in that direction. That might represent a larger demand for this product. People maybe like to eat apples more, so the demand for apples shifts out. Now, what we also know is that when it happens, the price which was originally at that intersection, that price, is now going to shift up to this new higher price and higher quantity. So that's a movement in the price. And as you can see, people in this market, the firms supplying the apples and the consumers of the apples, they're going to notice that the price has increased. So it's a signal that something's happened. If you're producing apples, it's a signal, hey, maybe people like more apples these days. And if you're buying apples, you go to the grocery store, you see the price is higher, it's a signal something's going on in this market. So in particular, what this has caused is a shift in the demand curve, caused by is a shift in the demand curve. So that's the signal. Then there's the incentive. The higher price of apples gives incentive for the growers, the apple farmers, to produce more. And so it's basically a movement along their supply curve. And so it gives them the incentive. Hey, I can get more for these apples. Now I have incentive to use my capabilities, my higher labor to produce more apples as a result. And finally, it affects the distribution of income, and you can see that right here because, of course, when you compare the old price to the new price, at the new price, the firms are getting more money, but the consumers are paying more money. So it's moving the distribution of income towards the firms or the producers of the apples from the consumers of the apples. So you can see these very important, these three important roles for prices right in this little simple model. Now, as I've drawn this picture, there's a real question about how steep the curves are, how flat they are, and economists really need to know those in order to make this model useful. You have to know how much the price will change, and that depends on the slopes of the curves. So economists have developed this concept of elasticity to talk about this. Elasticity is nothing more than a measure of the sensitivity of the quantity demanded to the price, elasticity of demand. Sometimes to be specific, we call it the price elasticity of demand. So just a sensitivity, if the price of apples goes up, does the quantity demanded go up by a lot, or does the quantity demanded go up by just a little bit? That's the sensitivity of the quantity demanded to that price. It's a particular numerical measure too, which is really just comparing the percentage change in the quantity demanded to the percentage change in price. In fact, the price elasticity is defined as the ratio of that percentage change in the quantity demanded of apples or whatever to the percentage change in the price. And so, for example, if the price elasticity of demand is 0.5, then an increase in the price by 10% will lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of 5%. That's the 0.5% over 10%. And so that's your measure of the elasticity. You can think about the importance of this by going back and looking at the diagram of supply and demand. And so this is one which we've drawn to compare two different elasticities, one large and one small. In the top part of the graph, it's an elasticity which is high. And so that represents a large sensitivity of the change in the quantity to the change in the price. Just a small change in the price results in a big change in the quantity. As you, in this case, increase the price from at what it is at A to what it is at B, moving from A to B, you can see it's a relatively small increase in the price, but a big increase in the quantity demanded. So that's a high elasticity, and you can see it kind of by the slope of that curve. And the one below is the reverse. This is a case where there's a elasticity which is quite low, and so in this case, as you raise the price from where it is at A to where it is at C, you get a relatively small decline in the quantity demanded. So that elasticity is really important if you want to figure out how much the market is going to change, how much more quantity demanded will be or less quantity demanded will be when the price changes. And economists have ways to estimate, to compute that by looking at data, looking at historical experience. It's not that we can always measure it precisely, but that's really how we make the models work in practice. Now, the same thing can be done with respect to supply and other concepts as well, but let's just take a look at sort of extreme cases of elasticity. Sometimes we can think of perfectly elastic things where just a teeny weeny change in the price creates an enormous change is in elasticity. It's almost like a flat line completely. It's just an enormous, infinite change, if you like, in the quantity for just a small change in the price. And the reverse, which is perfectly inelastic, is where you can have a gigantic change in the price and you won't get any change in the quantity. That could be something that's completely fixed. No matter how much you change the price of a Mona Lisa, you're not going to get more Mona Lisas produced. There's one of them and that's it, so it's really perfectly inelastic. We also sometimes think about whether a good has an elastic price sensitivity or inelastic. And that's defined actually just by whether it's equal to 1 or greater than 1 and less than 1. In particular, we say a good has an elastic price, it's an elastic good if the elasticity of demand is greater than 1, and inelastic if the elasticity of demand is less than 1, just purely a definition. And then finally, elasticity kind of depends on the time frame you're looking at. Sometimes the elasticity in the very short run before people have a chance to adjust their behavior is quite low, but in the long run it can become high. If you, for example, change the price of gasoline, if the price of gasoline goes up, that might not affect the quantity demanded very much in the short run because people have their cars, they have the amount of gasoline consumption they're doing, but eventually they can get cars which consume less gasoline, and that makes the elasticity higher in the long run. So this short run versus long run is very important as well when you think about elasticity. So as I say, you can think about elasticity with respect to demand as well as price. So as well as supply and demand. So let's look at supply and think about that for a few minutes. The price elasticity of supply conceptually is the same as the price elasticity of demand. Here it's a measure of the sensitivity of the quantity supplied to the change in the price. Quantity supplied relative to the price. We measure in the same way as the percentage change in the quantity supplied relative to the percentage change in the price. So that's a measure of that sensitivity. And just like in the price elasticity of demand, by using percentages in this way, you don't think so much about the units of measurement, whether it's the number of apples or the tons of apples, or whether you're measuring the prices of art or the prices of cabbage. Those have different prices. By thinking of percentages, you abstract from those units and you think simply about the percentage change, a much more useful concept, and that's why we use these percentages. So then finally, consider an example. Suppose the elasticity of supply is 0.5, then an increase in the price by 10% will increase the quantity supplied, increase the quantity supplied by 5%. That's that 0.5 we're talking about in the definition. So in this case, you can also illustrate it with the curves. So let's look at the supply curves. These are the upward sloping lines that we've discussed earlier. And I'm comparing two different price elasticities of supply in this diagram. In the top diagram, there's a situation where a very high price elasticity of demand. And in this case, just a small change in the price. You can see going from A up to B here is a small change in the price results in a big increase in supply. So the firms really are providing a lot more production, oil, apples, whatever it happens to be, for this price increase. It's high elasticity. And of course, that means prices are going to make a big change in the economy. And at the other extreme, in the lower part, you have a situation where there's a low elasticity, low price elasticity of supply. In this case, the same kind of size price increase results in a small increase in supply. And therefore, we say the elasticity is very low. And we'll be seeing, as we go through and apply the supply and demand model, the impact of public policy, the impact of how the market can be designed in different ways, depends entirely on the elasticity of these curves. We'll consider that next time. Thank you.